Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. It's Monday, August 3rd, 2026, and the United States military is locked and loaded against Iran like never before. That's not a metaphor anymore. That's a literal description of what's sitting off the coast of Iran right now. 3 carrier strike groups in 1 theater. Stealth bombers cycling in and out of a single Indian Ocean airbase. Over 6 months of continuous combat operations. And an Ayatollah's regime that is finding out, night after night, what it actually means when the United States stops asking nicely. Let's talk about what's actually parked out there right now, because the numbers alone should tell you everything you need to know about how serious this has gotten. 3 carrier strike groups operating simultaneously in Central Command's area of responsibility. That's not something we've done in decades. Now, the last time you had 3 flat tops working the same theater at the same time, you have to go back generations. Carrier Strike Group 3, Carrier Strike Group 12, and Carrier Strike Group 10, which came steaming out of Norfolk and arrived in theater earlier this year to bring that number up to 3. Each one of those strike groups isn't just a single ship. Each one is a floating airbase with an air wing of FA-18 Super Hornets, EA-18G Growlers doing electronic warfare, E-2D Hawkeyes flying overhead watching everything that moves, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers loaded with vertical launch cells packed full of Tomahawks. You put 3 of those in the same body of water and what you've built isn't a deterrent anymore. It's an execution package. And that's just the Navy side, because while the carriers were steaming in, the Air Force was quietly building one of the most devastating strike packages this region has ever seen. B-2 Spirits, flying from Diego Garcia, dropping 2,000-pound bunker busters directly onto Iranian targets. B-52 Stratofortresses, hammering ballistic missile sites and command and control nodes. That's the heavy end of the stick right there. When you're sending B-2s and B-52s into the same operation, you're not degrading a target, you're erasing it. And CENTCOM's own commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, stood up in front of cameras at Tampa headquarters and said it flat out. U.S. forces are not holding back on the mission to sink the entire Iranian Navy. Not damage it, not contain it, sink it. That's about as unambiguous as a 4-star combatant commander gets. This whole campaign has a name now too, Operation Epic Fury. And it kicked off back in February when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on military, government, and infrastructure sites across Iran. And in the opening days of that campaign, they didn't just hit buildings, they hit people. Senior Iranian officials were taken off the board in those first strikes, including the supreme leader himself. Think about that for a second. This isn't a limited punitive strike like we saw back in 2020 with Soleimani. This is a sustained war aimed at dismantling the regime's ability to function, its ability to project power, and depending on who you ask in Washington, potentially the regime itself. So how did we even get here? Because this didn't come out of nowhere. Back in late January, you started seeing the single largest American military buildup in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Air assets, naval assets, missile defense batteries, all flowing into the region at once. And the stated reasoning at the time was multi-layered. Stop the killing of protesters during the mass demonstrations that had been rocking Iran, prevent Iran from finishing whatever weapons program they were working on, and prepare strike options in case diplomacy failed. Well, diplomacy failed spectacularly. And by the end of February, the buildup turned into the real thing. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this war has not been a straight line of escalation. It's had ceasefires, memorandums of understanding, negotiation windows, and then explosions right back into open combat. Back in June, the 2 sides actually signed a memorandum of understanding aimed at ending hostilities and reopening the Strait of Hormuz. On paper, that should have been the off-ramp. That should have been the moment everybody exhales. Instead, Iran took that opening and tried to use it to assert control over the strait anyway, demanding that commercial vessels follow Iranian-approved routes, essentially trying to run a toll booth through one of the most important choke points on the planet. And when 3 commercial ships got hit in the first week of July, President Trump made it clear on camera that he considered that truce over. From that point forward, the strikes never really stopped. Go back and look at the CENTCOM press releases from just the last month. July 8th, a round of strikes to punish Iran for attacking commercial shipping. July 11th, a 3rd round that same week. July 12th, dozens of targets hit across multiple locations with precision munitions. July 22nd, another wave, the 12th consecutive night of strikes at that point. This is not a one-off retaliation. This is a rolling campaign that has been running for months with barely a pause. And every single time Iran tries something in the strait, the response comes within days, sometimes within hours. And that's really the core of what's happening here strategically. Iran's entire play in this war has been the Strait of Hormuz. It's the only card they have left that actually threatens the global economy, and they know it. Roughly a fifth of the world's oil moves through that waterway, and Iran's whole strategy has been to try and turn that choke point into a weapon, disrupting shipping, harassing tankers, trying to force the world to pressure Washington into backing off. But here's the problem with that plan. The United States Navy does not share the sea with anyone it doesn't want to. Thousands of ships have transited that strait over the past several months, despite everything Iran has tried, and every claim out of Tehran that they've closed the waterway has been debunked within days by satellite tracking and by the ships themselves still moving through it. Iran doesn't own the Strait of Hormuz. They just live next to it. And there's a massive difference between those two things. Now, let's talk about what all this firepower is actually doing on the ground, because it's not just about symbolism. The target sets have been specific, and they've been relentless. Ballistic missile launchers, over 190 of them reportedly destroyed at this point. Naval vessels, over 150 destroyed or damaged, which tells you Admiral Cooper wasn't exaggerating when he said the mission was to sink the entire Iranian Navy. Radar systems, more than a dozen destroyed or degraded, including multiple Patriot-style acquisition radars and long-range early warning systems that Iran had been relying on to see American aircraft coming. When you take out that much of somebody's radar picture, you're not just hurting their offense, you're blinding their defense. You're taking away their ability to even know what's inbound until it's already gone off. And the human cost on Iran's side has been staggering, at least by the estimates coming out of American and Israeli assessments. We're talking about more than 6,000 Iranian military personnel killed and around 15,000 wounded, according to those figures. Independent human rights monitoring groups tracking casualties inside Iran have put the overall death toll, military and civilian combined, well into the thousands, with tens of thousands more injured. Now look, I always want to be careful with these numbers because fog of war is real, and every side in a conflict like this has an incentive to shape the narrative. But even taking the most conservative estimates seriously, this has been one of the most lopsided air campaigns fought in the modern era. Iran's regional proxies haven't been spared either. Hezbollah has reportedly lost over 1,000 fighters. The Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, dozens killed, hundreds wounded. This is what happens when the entire network gets targeted at once instead of just the head. It hasn't been a one-way street, though, and I think it's important to be honest about that. Iran has managed to land blows, too. American forces have taken casualties, more than a dozen killed and several hundred wounded by official figures. Israel has taken a heavier toll, with dozens of soldiers and civilians killed and thousands injured from missile and drone barrages that have gotten through despite Iron Dome and other layered defenses. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Kuwait have all been hit as well, because Iran's response to getting hammered has been exactly what you'd expect from a regime that's losing. Spread the pain to anyone hosting American aircraft. Kuwait alone has reported multiple soldiers and civilians killed with dozens more wounded from Iranian drone and missile attacks aimed at facilities that support the American mission. This is the price of being a neighbor to a regime that would rather burn the whole block down than admit it's cornered. Now let's talk about the ground piece of this, because everybody focuses on the jets and the ships, but there's a serious footprint of American ground forces postured around this fight as well. You've got the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne in theater, along with the 10th Mountain Division. You've got Marine Expeditionary Units, the 31st and the 11th, which give you that amphibious rapid response capability if things go sideways near the coast. And then you've got the units that don't officially exist until they're already in and out. Delta Force, Army Rangers, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Navy SEALs. When you stack Special Operations Aviation, like the 160th Regiment alongside those units, you're not just threatening airstrikes anymore. You're threatening direct action. You're threatening the kind of operations that took out bin Laden. That is a message Tehran understands, whether they admit it publicly or not. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Just a few days ago, CENTCOM reportedly drafted a 2-week bombing plan targeting Iran. And what made that story interesting wasn't the plan itself. It was the fact that it came together during a stretch where American carrier presence near Iran's coast was actually thin. The exact positioning of the Abraham Lincoln and the George H. W. Bush wasn't publicly clear at that moment, and some analysts read that gap as a sign that a full-scale immediate escalation was less likely in the very short term. And you know what? That's actually a really useful lesson in how to read this conflict. The presence or absence of a carrier off the coast tells you more about the real intent in Washington than half of the rhetoric coming out of press conferences. When the flat tops are close, that's when you brace. When they're repositioning, that's usually diplomacy, trying to find a little bit of oxygen. And that brings us to right now, because this weekend has been a wild ride even by this war's standards. Just days ago, the United States was preparing what was described as a heavy campaign against Iranian energy infrastructure. Refineries, power generation, the kind of targets that would genuinely cripple the regime's ability to fund itself. Reports had planners discussing wrapping strikes before markets opened on a Monday morning, which tells you how calculated this is. This isn't just about degrading military capability anymore. It's about squeezing the economic lifeline that keeps the whole apparatus running. But then, in a move that's honestly very on brand for how this war has gone, President Trump announced the strikes were being called off, at least for now, after Iran and other regional governments reportedly asked him to hold off. Sources indicated he had a direct conversation with Saudi leadership, who raised real concerns about what a strike on energy infrastructure could do to a region that is still economically tethered to that pipeline of oil moving through the Gulf. The Saudis need the Strait open. They need stability in the oil markets. And when the country holding the biggest checkbook in the region asks you to pump the brakes, even a commander-in-chief who has said he wants to hit Iran very hard is going to listen. So where does that leave things as of right now? Reports out of the region indicate negotiations between the U.S. and Iran are set to resume, with talks scheduled to begin fresh this week, and Trump himself has used the word imminent when describing a potential new deal. Now, I want you to sit with that word for a second, because we've heard imminent before in this war. We heard it before the June memorandum that fell apart within weeks. Imminent in this conflict has had a habit of turning into extended before it turns into signed. So while there's genuine reason for cautious optimism that a real de-escalation could be close, there's also a very real pattern here of Iran using negotiation windows as a chance to regroup, rearm, and then test the water again the second they think attention has shifted elsewhere. And that's exactly why the phrase locked and loaded actually matters here. Because even while diplomats are talking, the posture hasn't changed. The carriers haven't left. The bombers haven't stood down. CENTCOM has made it clear over and over again in these press releases that operations continue to degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping and regional stability, regardless of what's happening at the negotiating table. That's the real lesson of the last 6 months of this war. Talking and striking are not mutually exclusive anymore. Washington has learned that the only language this regime consistently responds to with any seriousness is force. And every time there's been a lull in strikes followed by a pause in aggression from Tehran, it's followed a period of sustained military pressure, not the other way around. Let's talk about Iran's actual military reality right now, because I think people still have this outdated picture in their head of Iran as this untouchable fortress bristling with missiles nobody can stop. That picture is not accurate anymore. Iran's radar network has been gutted. Their navy, by CENTCOM's own words, is being systematically sunk. Their ballistic missile infrastructure has taken hit after hit, with launcher after launcher destroyed. Their proxy network, the entire web of Hezbollah and the various militias across Iraq and the region that Iran built up over decades specifically to give themselves deniable striking power, has been bled dry, with over 1,000 Hezbollah fighters killed alone. What's left in Iran's toolkit at this point is what it's always been at the end of the day when the sophisticated stuff runs out. Drones. Cheap ballistic missiles fired in salvos hoping something gets through. And harassment tactics in the Strait, using small, fast attack boats because their actual navy doesn't have much left to work with. That's not the posture of a regime that's winning. That's the posture of a regime that is running out of good options and is stalling for time. But here's the thing that should give everyone pause before declaring this thing over. A wounded regime with nothing left to lose is often more dangerous in the short term, not less. When a government knows its economy is being strangled, when it knows its military infrastructure is being taken apart piece by piece, and when it knows every proxy group it built to insulate itself is getting chewed up in the process, the calculation inside that government can shift from we need to survive this to we need to make them pay for this, regardless of what happens to us next. That's the scenario American planners have to account for, even as negotiations restart. It's why you don't see the carriers pulling all the way out. It's why B-2s are still flying sorties out of Diego Garcia. It's why Patriot batteries are still up and manned across the region. You don't stand down from locked and loaded just because someone picked up the phone. Let's also talk about the regional coalition piece of this, because I think this gets underappreciated in a lot of the coverage. This isn't just America versus Iran anymore. Saudi Arabia has taken hits and has responded. The UAE has been directly targeted with soldiers and civilians killed and has pushed back. Kuwait has absorbed strikes on its own soil and has downed Iranian drones targeting its facilities. What you're watching happen in real time is the entire Gulf Cooperation Council quietly, and in some cases, not so quietly, aligning against Tehran in a way that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. These are countries that used to hedge their bets, that used to try and play both sides to avoid becoming a target. That calculation has changed because Iran removed the option of staying neutral the moment they started hitting Kuwaiti and Emirati soil to punish them for hosting American assets. When you attack your neighbors for the crime of doing business with the United States, you don't get to be surprised when those neighbors stop hedging and start actively supporting the other side. Now think about what that means long-term for the balance of power in this region, because this is bigger than just who wins this particular war. For decades, Iran's entire regional strategy was built around asymmetric proxy warfare specifically because they knew they couldn't win a direct conventional fight against the United States or against a coalition of Gulf states backed by American air power. That strategy worked for a long time because it kept the cost of confrontation low for Iran while making it expensive and politically messy for everyone else to respond. What's happened over the past 6 months has essentially called that bluff at every level simultaneously. The proxies got hit directly. The homeland got hit directly. The economy got hit directly. There was no insulation layer left to hide behind. And that's a strategic problem for Iran that doesn't get solved by one ceasefire or one round of negotiations. It's a fundamental unraveling of the entire model they built their regional influence on. I also want to touch on something that doesn't get talked about enough, which is the technology gap that this war has put on full display. When you watch B-2 Spirits flying from Diego Garcia to drop precision munitions on hardened targets and then flying home, when you watch 3 separate carrier strike groups coordinate air operations across an entire theater without losing the ability to communicate or target effectively, when you watch electronic warfare aircraft essentially blind an adversary's radar picture before the strike package even shows up, you're watching the difference between a military built around 5th and 6th generation integrated warfare and a military that is still, at its core, relying on mass and desperation. Iran's counter to all of this has been drones and ballistic missiles fired in volume, hoping saturation beats interception. And look, sometimes that tactic works on the margins. Some missiles do get through. Some drones do hit their targets. But volume alone does not close a gap this wide. It just changes how long it takes to lose. So let's zoom out and ask the bigger strategic question everybody actually wants answered. Does this end with a negotiated deal, or does this end with regime collapse? Because those are genuinely the 2 paths this conflict has been oscillating between since February. The optimistic read is that Iran has been sufficiently degraded militarily and economically that the leadership left standing after the assassinations in February understands there is no path to victory here. Only a question of how much more damage they're willing to absorb before formally accepting terms that reopen the strait, roll back the weapons programs, and end the strikes on shipping. Under that read, the talks resuming this week and Trump's language about an imminent deal represent real progress toward an actual conclusion. The more pessimistic read, and it's one grounded in exactly how this war has behaved for 6 months now, is that Iran uses every negotiation window as a chance to rearm, regroup, and probe for weakness, and that the moment American attention or resolve appears to soften even slightly, you see another attack on shipping, another drone swarm at a Gulf ally, another spike in violence that resets the whole cycle. We've already seen this pattern once with the June memorandum. It fell apart within weeks. There's no guarantee this round of talks avoids the same fate. What I'd say is this: watch the carriers. Watch whether CENTCOM keeps publishing those strike completion releases even during active negotiations, because that's been the tell all along. Every time the releases keep coming during a diplomatic window, that's Washington signaling it doesn't trust the process enough to fully stand down. And historically, that instinct has been correct. The moment you stop seeing those releases entirely for an extended stretch, that's when you'll know something has actually shifted in a durable way. And I think it's worth stepping back and appreciating just how significant it is that we're even having this conversation about an American military posture, this dominant in one theater. 3 carrier strike groups, stealth bombers still flying effective sorties, not training runs. Ground forces still postured and ready if it comes to that. Regional allies actively fighting alongside instead of quietly hoping it all blows over. This is what deterrence looks like when it's actually been tested and has actually held. Iran gambled that American resolve would crack the way it appeared to in past decades when conflicts dragged on without clear outcomes. Instead, they ran into a campaign that has been sustained, coordinated, and remarkably consistent. For 6 straight months with no sign of the underlying military commitment wavering, even as the political negotiating track has opened and closed multiple times. So keep watching this space, because whatever happens next, whether it's a real breakthrough at the table or another round of strikes before the week is out, it's going to be one of the more consequential developments in this region in a long time. Now, I want to hear from you on this one, because there's a real debate to be had here. Do you think this ends with Iran actually signing a real deal this time and sticking to it? Or do you think we're looking at another temporary pause before this cycles right back into open strikes within a matter of weeks? Drop your take in the comments, because I read every single one of them, and some of the best analysis often comes straight from you guys breaking down angles that don't always make the headlines. If this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening on the ground is valuable to you, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps push this content out to more people who need to understand what's unfolding in real time, instead of just getting the 30-second version on the evening news. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications, because this situation is moving fast, sometimes multiple developments in a single day, and every update will be covered right here as it happens. Let's talk a little more about the hardware itself, because I think it's worth understanding why these specific platforms were chosen for this fight and what that tells you about the actual objectives. The B-2 is not a cheap airplane to fly. Every single sortie out of Diego Garcia represents a massive logistical and financial commitment. Air refueling all the way across the Indian Ocean. Maintenance crews working around the clock to keep that low, observable coding and flying condition, and a flight profile that puts one of America's most expensive and irreplaceable assets directly over contested airspace. You don't do that for symbolic strikes. You do that when the target actually requires precision penetration of hardened or deeply buried facilities that nothing else in the inventory can reliably crack. When B-2s are dropping 2,000-pound bunker busters on Iranian sites repeatedly over the course of this campaign, that tells you exactly what kind of infrastructure Iran had been building underground, and it tells you Washington had target intelligence specific enough to know precisely where to put those weapons. The B-52 piece of this is interesting too, because the Stratofortress isn't a stealth platform at all. It's an old airframe, but it's an incredibly effective one for a very specific job, which is standoff strikes against fixed targets using large weapons payloads from outside the range of most air defense systems. When B-52s are going after ballistic missile sites and command and control nodes, that's a mission built around mass and reach rather than stealth. And it tells you the strategy has been to hit as much of Iran's missile infrastructure as possible in a short window, because every launcher destroyed on the ground is one less salvo that can be fired at a Gulf ally or at American forces later. And then you've got the carrier air wings doing the daily grind, the FA-18 Super Hornets flying around the clock sorties, as CENTCOM themselves put it, keeping the fight going continuously rather than in isolated bursts. That's a deliberate operational tempo decision. Constant pressure instead of occasional big hits. It denies the adversary any real window to rebuild or reposition between strikes, and honestly, that consistent grinding pressure has probably done more long-term damage to Iran's overall capability than any single spectacular strike could have. There's also a piece of this that doesn't get enough attention, which is what's happening underwater. Guided missile submarines have reportedly been part of this posture from the early buildup phase. And those platforms are incredibly valuable in a fight like this precisely because they're invisible until the moment they're not. A submarine doesn't need to announce itself with a flight plan or a carrier's radar signature. It can sit off the coast for weeks, gathering intelligence, positioning cruise missiles, and Iran genuinely has no reliable way to track or counter that threat, given how degraded their own naval and coastal surveillance capability has become after everything that's been hit over the past 6 months. Let's also give some real credit to the missile defense side of this equation, because it doesn't get the same highlight reel treatment as fighter jets and bombers, but it's arguably just as important. Patriot batteries have been running around the clock across multiple countries in the region, intercepting incoming Iranian ballistic missiles, and protecting both American forces and civilian populations in host nations. Every single successful intercept is a missile that didn't hit an airbase, didn't hit a city, didn't kill anybody. That's unglamorous, thankless work compared to a fighter pilot's gun camera footage, but it's honestly one of the most important reasons casualty numbers on the American and Allied side, while real and serious, haven't been catastrophically higher, given the sheer volume of missiles and drones Iran has thrown at this region over the past 6 months. I also want to address something that comes up constantly whenever this topic gets covered, which is the question of whether any of this is actually working, or whether it's just an endless cycle of strikes without a real endpoint. And look, I think that's a completely fair question to ask about any prolonged military campaign, but when you actually look at the trajectory here rather than just the day-to-day noise, the answer is clearly yes. This has degraded Iran's capability in a measurable, verifiable way. Their navy has been gutted. Their radar coverage has holes in it that didn't exist 6 months ago. Their proxy network has taken losses it will take years, maybe a decade or more to rebuild. Their economy is being squeezed through both direct infrastructure targeting and the broader sanctions and blockade pressure around the strait. None of that is speculative commentary. That's the picture painted by the campaign's own results over 6 straight months of sustained operations. What remains, genuinely uncertain, is the political endpoint, not the military one. Militarily, this fight has a clear direction, and it's not in Iran's favor. Politically, the question of whether the regime accepts terms, whether there's some kind of internal shift in Tehran, given how badly this has gone, or whether this just grinds on in cycles of negotiation and relapse for months or years to come, that's the piece nobody can predict with certainty right now, including the people actually running this campaign. But if I had to bet based on the pattern we've seen, sustained military pressure followed by genuine progress at the table, followed by Iranian violations, followed by renewed strikes, I'd say we're likely looking at more of that same cycle before we see a truly durable resolution. The posture staying locked and loaded even during this latest negotiating window is the clearest signal Washington itself doesn't fully believe this is over yet either. One more thing worth mentioning before we wrap this up, and it's something that I think gets lost in a lot of the day-to-day coverage of individual strikes and individual statements. This entire campaign represents a fundamental test of something bigger than just this one conflict. It's a test of whether American military dominance, built and maintained over decades at enormous cost, can still be projected effectively and sustained over a long-duration fight in a contested theater against an adversary that has spent years specifically trying to build asymmetric ways around that dominance. 6 months in, 3 carrier strike groups still operating, stealth bombers still flying effective sorties, ground forces still postured and ready, and a regional coalition that has only gotten stronger and more unified rather than fracturing under pressure. That's a pretty clear answer to that test so far. Whether the political outcome matches that military reality is still being written, and it's being written in real time this week as negotiations resume. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the update the moment it drops. Drop your prediction in the comments on which way you think this goes, and share this with anyone you know who's been trying to actually understand what's happening in the Middle East beyond just the headline of the day. There's a lot more nuance here than most coverage gives it credit for, and staying informed on the actual details is the only way to see where this is really headed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.